Pentagon Papers is one of the all-time great topics to hold forth about. It is such an interesting um, part of the much larger story of the Vietnam War, and something that I come back to again and again and again in thinking about the war. I think it's a fascinating story that plays out across 1969, 70, 71, down to 73, that really gives us a way to get traction on so many of the complicated political and ideological currents that were playing out in that moment. But of course, the Pentagon Papers also, as I'll try to suggest toward the end of my presentation, continues really to echo in the present moment, in the 21st century. A lot of what flowed from the Pentagon Papers case, I think, still holds up as giving shape to the basics of the relationship between the federal government and the media when it comes to handling of secret material. I guess I've suggested that the Pentagon Papers is sort of a sidelight, or a sidebar to the larger story of Vietnam. But of course, it is a vast story in and of itself, and it's a challenge to try to make sense of this subject in just half an hour, or perhaps even a little bit less, because I want to leave plenty of time for discussion of the primary sources, and also to try to answer your questions. So the way I thought I would structure my little presentation is simply to address three questions. The first one is very, very simple, and that is simply, what were the Pentagon Papers? I want to make sure all of us are on the same page and know the basics about the Pentagon Papers, what they were, what their origins were. And then I want to turn to the question of why it was that the Pentagon Papers became so controversial. And of course, this will lead us into Daniel Ellsberg's disclosure of the papers and the publication of the papers and the legal cases that grew up around the case, around the papers. And then I want finally to turn to the long-term implications. What are the big implications that flow from the Pentagon Papers event? And hopefully that will set us up well for some discussion in a little bit. So what were the Pentagon Papers? Well, simply put, they were a 7,000 or so page study that was initially produced in 47 separate volumes. All of them went under the title, the rather drab and boring title, United States-Vietnam Relations, 1945 to 1967, Report of the Office of the Secretary of Defense Vietnam Task Force. Really one of the more tedious titles in all of title writing, I think, over the years. But the study had its origins in June 1967, and this was, of course, at a time in the history of the war when the fighting had really bogged down into a stalemate. Certainly the introduction of United States forces in 1965 and the escalation of the American military commitment in 65, 66, early 1967 had eliminated the possibility that South Vietnam was going to collapse in the near term. But at the same time, the United States was clearly not making serious progress toward anything that could reasonably be called victory. So the war had really bogged down into a stalemate, with clearly mounting casualties on both sides. And it was in this context that the American Defense Secretary, Robert Mcnamara, serving in the Lyndon Johnson administration, wanted to understand how it was that the United States had become embroiled in Vietnam in the first place. And so he ordered a study to try to come to grips with the long history of American engagement in Vietnam, going all the way back to 1945. Exactly what Mcnamara's purpose was has, I think it's fair to say, never been entirely clear. Was it purely for his own edification? Was it designed to help the bureaucracy understand how to avoid similar fiascos in the future? What exactly were his motives, I think, has never been entirely clear. But I think it's fair to say, safe to say, that it emerged from this sense, this broad sense of frustration and a desire to understand how it was that the United States had gotten into this mess. So the study was completed by a team of both military and civilian experts in different dimensions of the history of the war. Ultimately, one estimate is there were about 36 different people who worked on the report. It covered, as you can tell from the title, decision-making by American policymakers stretching from 1945 to 1968. So it covers about 23 years of history and 4 presidential administrations. It covers the Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson presidency. Another important point to make about, just by way of establishing what this thing is that we call the Pentagon Papers, is to note that it includes both original documents. So at some level, it is a compilation of primary source materials, and in this regard, it's kind of an interesting collection for teachers, perhaps to use, if only to draw original source material. You can count on the fact that someone has thought a lot about what documents to highlight, what documents from 1945 or 50 or 64, et cetera, really capture the essence of American decision making. So there is some value in using the Pentagon Papers material, I think, just to find good primary source material. But it also included historical narrative that was written by this 36 or so member team that worked on the study. So in a sense, it is both an anthology of important documents, and the anthology is estimated at around 4,000 of those 7,000 pages, and a historical study, and the historical study part is estimated to be about 3,000 pages. At any rate, the finished product, all 7,000 pages, 47 volumes, was presented to the Secretary of Defense, not Mcnamara, who had left that office earlier in the Johnson presidency, but to his successor, Defense Secretary Clark Clifford, on January 15th, 1969. So it took the better part of 2 years to put this whole thing together. Interestingly, the report was handed to Clifford just 5 days before Richard Nixon came into office. If you bear with me for just a moment, I want to share my screen and show you a couple of pictures. Let me see. Here we go. Okay, so it's just my intro slide. I'll come back to that front page of the New York Times from June 13th. This is not a great slide, I acknowledge. This is the only slide I could find easily online that captures what the original Pentagon Papers documents looked like. They had these blue, covers. The sense, and I'll talk about this, the Pentagon Papers has been published in various forms, but this was the original as it was produced within the Pentagon. Okay, so this top secret study is finished up in early 1969, and it would become public, would become the center of a political firestorm in 1971. What happened in the meantime? What is the backstory to the revelation of the Pentagon Papers? To really grapple with this question, I think it's useful to focus on a man whose name I think will be known to everybody probably who is in attendance tonight, Daniel Ellsberg. And I'll come back to that slide, but let me fast forward here to the man at the center of the controversy. Daniel Ellsberg is an absolutely fascinating figure, born in the 1930s. He's now, I think, 91 years old. Born in Chicago. His parents were killed very early in his life in a tragic accident. He's a superstar student, wound up, long story short, at Harvard. shortly after graduating, joined the Marine Corps, a very unconventional move for someone of his background and his academic accomplishments. But he served for a few years as a platoon leader, among other positions, in the Marines. He left the Marines in the late 1950s, returned to graduate school, and ultimately got a PhD in economics at Harvard, was given a junior fellowship, very, very prestigious award at Harvard. This was an extraordinarily bright individual with truly impressive academic accomplishments. He worked first and foremost, and I've just been rereading his memoir in preparation for our program tonight. He cared first and foremost about nuclear weapons. His commitment was to understand nuclear weapons and to help his superiors, once he went to work for the federal government, for the Pentagon, to understand how to control nuclear weapons, how to assure that nuclear weapons were never used in the Cold War crises that, of course, popped up with some regularity across these years. So his first intellectual, his main intellectual interests were hardly focused on Vietnam or really anything close to the American experience in Vietnam. They were rather focused on nuclear weapons. But he went to work for the RAND Corporation. This is an Air Force-funded think tank based in Santa Monica, California. And thereafter, sort of across the 1960s, he toggled between the worlds of academia, the Pentagon, and the RAND Corporation. He was truly remarkably sort of successful and valued, I think it's fair to say, as an extraordinarily savvy and brilliant thinker in each one of these worlds. And he handled classified information all the time. He served as a trusted advisor to John McNaughton, who is the Deputy Secretary of Defense. So McNaughton was in some ways the number two behind Robert McNamara. So if you think about the hierarchy, Ellsberg was sort of working for the guy who was McNamara's most senior lieutenant, very highly placed in short. As he was called on in the 1960s to bring his brilliance to bear on Vietnam, he spent a good amount of time in Vietnam. He made inspection trips, and he was proud of the fact, I think it's fair to say, that he didn't confine himself on these inspection trips just to sitting in the military headquarters or listening to briefings from the top brass. He actually went out into the countryside, conducted inspections very close to the front lines, experienced combat, and really got very, very, very close to the war at the grassroots. So this was someone who increasingly understood, I think it's fair to say, Vietnam, not just as an abstract policy problem, but also understood it in very human terms, in terms of the destruction that it was causing in Vietnam, and the stresses and strains of the men who were called on to fight the war on the front lines. So long story short, by 1969 or so, Daniel Ellsberg had grown increasingly disillusioned about the war. He was increasingly doubtful about the ability of the United States to achieve its objectives in the war. And in 1969, those doubts kind of went to the next level. He had hoped that the end of the Johnson presidency and the emergence of Richard Nixon, the start of the Nixon administration, would be a watershed moment that would enable American policymakers to start to wind down the war, to fully recognize that the war could not be won in any meaningful sense. But he started to realize, even before Richard Nixon came into office, that the Nixon presidency was unlikely to take serious steps to withdraw the United States anytime soon. Indeed, he believed with some justification based on the classified records that he was seeing on a regular basis, that the Nixon administration was, if anything, likely to expand the war in ways that he considered very unfortunate and probably counterproductive. So it's in this context that that Ellsberg began to think of taking very dramatic, radical steps to do his part to call the public's attention, to call Congress's attention to what he believed was a very dangerous situation. And it's also worth pointing out here that Ellsberg was that sort of Renaissance man who read very widely. We might not expect someone who is spending, very long days thinking about nuclear weapons or the Vietnam War to read into Gandhian nonviolence, to read Henry David Thoreau. But Ellsberg, this quirky individual with this wide array of interests, increasingly, at least as so he tells us in his memoir called Secrets, very interesting book, that he increasingly became fascinated with these figures and even participated in anti-war activities in 1969, hoping all the while that his bosses at Rand and in the Pentagon would not see him on the news or see him in a photo in the Washington Post or the New York Times or somewhere else. So gradually in 1969, Ellsberg realizes that one of the things he can do to call attention to what he believes is the real horror and unwinnability of the war is to disclose this study. He had participated in a relatively small way as one of those 36 compilers of the study, but he was intimately familiar with the fact that it existed. And he also knew that a couple of copies of the Pentagon Papers were available at the Rand Corporation, where he happened to be working in 1969. So in October 1969, he smuggles this study in small batches out of the Rand offices. And here's a picture of what the Rand Corporation in Santa Monica looked like back in 1969 or so. And he took it to a copy shop or to a PR agency actually that had a photocopier. This PR agency was owned by the girlfriend of Ellsberg's co-conspirator in all this, a guy named Anthony Russo. So it was really a very cloak and dagger sort of thing, literally sneaking the documents out in Ellsberg's briefcase at night, hoping that the guards wouldn't stop him or question him, that he could just simply pass right by the guard station. But he was able to do it, and over a period of days manages to make a full set with the collaboration, as I mentioned, of Anthony Russo. Ellsberg's first move, once he had this material, was to take it to Congress. He hoped that the availability of this material would lead sympathetic members of Congress to hold hearings that would expose the duplicity, that would expose the mistakes that had driven American decisions in Vietnam, and thereby emphasize the urgency of winding down the war, changing course, and getting the United States out of Vietnam. Very long story here. There's a lot of detail that is fascinating, but I'll just mention that Ellsberg tries the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, J. William Fulbright. He tries George McGovern, who of course becomes the Democratic candidate for the presidency in 1972. And especially he focuses on the Senator Charles Mathias from Maryland, who was a Republican. And both Mathias and Ellsberg seemed to see the logic in a Republican being the person who would make this information public and hold hearings. The thinking was that this would really give additional credibility to the process. But Fulbright, McGovern, ultimately Mathias really don't show much interest during 1970 in moving forward with hearings. And Ellsberg was largely disappointed with what he was hearing from these members of the Senate that he approached. So it was in this context that Ellsberg makes, of course, his fateful move. He approaches the New York Times through a reporter named Neil Sheehan, someone whom Ellsberg had known back in the days when he was traveling with some regularity to Vietnam. The New York Times was initially cautious, But ultimately, after a lot of internal discussion, goes forward with publication of what would at this point become known as the Pentagon Papers. The New York Times put together a team of reporters, editors, researchers who met in a special suite in the New York Hilton, again, very cloak and dagger. This was all sort of super secret, particularly in the very tense days before the beginning of the publication, when New York Times editors and officials really worried that, you know, the next people through the door would be the FBI, having learned that Ellsberg had leaked all of this material. But no such FBI visit ever took place, and on June 13th, 1971, publication of the Pentagon Papers begins. By the end of the month, other papers had also gotten into the act, the Washington Post most importantly, but also 15 other newspapers had begun publishing parts of the Pentagon Papers. Well, before I talk about the Nixon administration's reaction to this, let me just touch briefly on what it was about the Pentagon Papers that was so spectacular, that was so that generated headlines. Broadly speaking, the Pentagon Papers show that the public assurances that every president from Truman through LBJ had offered, that the war was going well, that the United States was on its way to victory, were very much at odds with the secret history of decision-making, which showed that American officials were keenly aware of problems, of setbacks, of, in fact, the unlikelihood of achieving American objectives, short of measures that were widely regarded as inappropriate to the importance, ultimately, of a country like Vietnam in the global Cold War. Let me just give you one. I mean, remember, there are 7,000 pages of material to draw on, but one tiny little nugget that suggests what drew the attention of those New York Times reporters and editors who had this material in 1971. Here is what Robert Mcnamara said about the war publicly on this date, December 21st, 1963. We received in great detail the plans of the South Vietnamese and the plans of our own military advisors for operations during 1964. We have every reason to believe they will be successful. Well, the Pentagon Papers revealed that secretly, in a memo to Lyndon Johnson, the story was very, very different. I think this juxtaposition of these two quotes captures in microcosm what many editors and reporters, but certainly many readers, found so striking about the Pentagon Papers. They seemed, in short, to reveal a pattern of deception, of dishonesty in the decisions connected to the escalation of the war. I'll just touch very quickly on some of the specific issues in the history of American involvement in Vietnam, where the Pentagon Papers called attention to sorry, I'm just rearranging my screen here, called attention to misrepresentation, deceit on the part of American officials. The official position about the establishment of, the official position about the very nature of the war in Vietnam was that the United States was coming to the aid of an independent nation that was under communist threat. Well, the Pentagon Papers revealed that the United States in the 1950s had played a major role really in creating and sustaining a very weak South Vietnam that scarcely deserved the label state, right? This political entity, the Pentagon Papers suggested, was very fragile and flimsy, and the United States had played a crucial role not only in creating it in the first place in 1954, but in keeping it on life support for years thereafter. So this is very much at odds with this idea that this was a freestanding, independent, robust state that was under attack from the outside. The Pentagon Papers also touched on the coup in 1963 against South Vietnamese leader Ngo Dinh Diem, an episode that many of you probably know about. The official position was that the United States had not been involved really in any way in the coup that overthrew Ngo Dinh Diem. Well, the Pentagon Papers showed relatively deep U.S. involvement in the plotting and support for the plotters that led to this important turning point in the history of the war. With respect to the Gulf of Tonkin, the official statements had indicated that the United States was U.S. warships were innocently attacked in 1964, and that the United States really sought no wider war. This was an act of North Vietnamese aggression against American warships. Well, the Pentagon Papers showed that this was not, that the truth was much more complicated than that the United States knew about and supported clandestine South Vietnamese attacks against the coast of North Vietnam, and that the North Vietnamese attacks on American warships, if they occurred at all, were in retaliation against what could arguably be called American provocation. Again, another example, in 1964, LBJ says publicly that the United States really seeks no wider war. The Pentagon Papers show that LBJ was in fact deliberating behind the scenes on the escalation of the war once the 1964 presidential race was over, and the political calculations were no longer an important part of decision making. And again, in 1965, once American bombing of North Vietnam had commenced, the standard line was that the bombing was, of course, working, that it was an important part of a winning strategy in Vietnam, but the Pentagon Papers revealed that, in fact, the bombing was not at all working, and that there was no good reason to think that the bombing, even in combination with the introduction of ground forces, would lead to an American victory. So these kinds of details were increasingly coming out in the pages of the New York Times. And of course, this caused a major furor on the nightly news. Other newspapers wanted to get into the act. The anti-war movement was certainly energized by the discoveries in the papers, in the pages of the New York Times. Now, what was the reaction within the Nixon administration? This is really a fascinating subject. I've put in the chat a link to some material on the National Security Archive website. I can talk more about this when we turn to documents in a few minutes. But you can see in both the recordings of Richard Nixon and his aides, but also the transcripts that are also easily available through that link, that at first Richard Nixon and his aides didn't really think this was that big a deal. In fact, they loved the fact that it mostly focused on Democrats. After all, Truman and especially Kennedy and Johnson were Democrats, and most of the embarrassing details, the evidence of duplicity, etc., really were connected to Democratic administrations. And so they weren't at first all that worked up about this issue, but within a couple of days, they start to come around to a different conclusion. And I think Jeremy can share some details about this if he'd care to. But Henry Kissinger was probably helpful in getting Nixon around to the view that, in fact, this was a very dangerous precedent. Regardless of the substance of the papers, the publication of this material, this top secret material, created a very dangerous precedent that would, if it were allowed to go forward, would encourage the media to publish secrets about the Nixon administration, or generally make life difficult for the Nixon presidency, which of course had pretty grand ambitions when it came to foreign and national security policy. So the Nixon administration asked for a restraining order against the New York Times to prohibit the further publication after 3 installments of the Pentagon Papers were published. And it gets its way. a court rules in favor of the Nixon administration, but the New York Times pursues the issue to a higher level, in fact, takes the issue to the Supreme Court. In this period when the Times had been forbidden from continuing publication, Ellsberg and others got the material to the Washington Post, which started publishing as well. And the Nixon administration, unsurprisingly, went after the Washington Post, asking for a similar restraining order to stop the Post from publishing. But in this case, interestingly, the judge ruled the other way, and the judge offered some of the most famous words in the history of the Pentagon Papers episode. "The security of the nation," wrote the judge, "is not at the ramparts alone. Security also lies in the value of our free institutions. A cantankerous press, an obstinate press, a ubiquitous press must be suffered by those in authority to preserve the even greater values of freedom of expression and the right of the people to know." Well, long story short, of course, it goes to the Supreme Court, which combined the New York Times and Washington Post cases into one case, although it is generally known as New York Times Company versus the United States. A hearing was held with remarkable speed. I mean, remember, the first publication of the Pentagon Papers in the Times was on June 13th. On June 26th, there's a hearing in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court issues its opinion on June 30th. A remarkable 15-day legal process that went all the way to the highest levels of the judicial system and resulted in one of the landmark rulings, I think most legal historians would say, in all of American legal history. So the result, and I want to spend most of our document session talking about the decision. I want to get deeply into that, so I won't belabor that point now. But generally, the result was a 6-3 decision that that dissolved the restraining orders against the Times and the Post and allowed these publications, and for that matter, other newspapers as well, to proceed with publication of the Pentagon Papers. So here was a remarkable ruling that upheld the right of the news media to report on even top secret material and forbid the federal government from engaging in the practice of prior restraint, that is, preventing the publication of material that was in the hands of the media. Let me turn, I'm sorry, I'm right at half an hour here, but let me turn very, very quickly to the long-term implications and legacies of the Pentagon Papers episodes, just to put out a couple of nuggets that we can talk about as we pursue our discussion. One of the most important implications, it seems to me, of the Pentagon Papers episode is that the episode led pretty directly to the Watergate scandal, and we all know what an important place, you all know, particularly after your session last week, I think, what an important place Watergate holds in American history and in the creation of the political culture in which I would argue we still in some ways live. The Pentagon Papers really heightened Richard Nixon's fear of leaks. It took him a little while to get to that conclusion, but I think if you look at those transcripts that I mentioned, you can really see that over a period of days, he works himself into a kind of fury over the leaks. And the Pentagon Papers, in short, led him to put together a team of sort of low-ranking, in some cases former CIA officials, to deal with leaks and essentially to perform dirty tricks for the administration. So this was the group known as the Plumbers, that would essentially be the same group that carried out the Watergate break-in in 1972. So it's certainly reasonable to see the Pentagon Papers as the beginning of that mentality and that temptation to perform dirty tricks that leads pretty directly to Watergate. And of course, one episode in particular from the Pentagon Papers episode really, makes this abundantly clear. The Nixon administration orders a break-in at Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office in California, hoping to obtain files that would enable the administration, no doubt working indirectly through third parties, to smear Ellsberg, to call into question his credibility and to sort of paint him as a nut, right, who was completely unreliable and unpatriotic. And then I think there's, another important implication brings us to this major victory for press freedom that, as I mentioned at the outset, continues very arguably to shape the nation's approach to the First Amendment and freedom of the press down to this day. Now, there is a conventional wisdom, I think, around the Pentagon Papers that it was this major blow for press freedom, perhaps, the biggest, or certainly one of the biggest in all of American history. And my own view is that there's a lot to that. I mean, indisputably, this is a major victory for the press. But there are some interesting caveats that have led a few commentators to cast at least a little bit of doubt on claims that the case marked this sort of total and uncomplicated victory for press freedoms. For one thing, there was really no clearly reasoned majority opinion. Rather, those 6 votes in the majority were really a collection of disparate opinions that arrived at the same conclusion via different routes. So there was no single body of reasoning that created a really firm footing for depriving the government of the ability to engage in prior restraint and so forth in subsequent years. So this is not to say that the Pentagon Papers hasn't, in fact, had a long-term impact, but the basis on which the aversion to prior restraint rests may be a little bit more flimsy than we sometimes are tempted to believe. The court also did not say that prior restraint may never be imposed, nor did it delineate the circumstances under which it might be imposed. So there are some, it left the door ajar, as some scholars of the Pentagon Papers have said, to different kinds of rulings in subsequent, in subsequent years. And then finally, it seems to me the Pentagon Papers has an effect at the very broadest level in American society. It encouraged a pattern of mistrust, of apologies, just trying to get my screen to do what I want it to do. There we go. Contributes to the pattern that is so strikingly represented in this chart. So here we see public trust in government playing out over a very long period of time since the Eisenhower years, and you can see that things really took a dramatic downturn in the years after 1965. And I would argue, though of course one can't be very precise about this, that the Pentagon Papers play an important role in that downturn. Now, I'm not sure that it belongs at the very top of the list of events in American life that created this trend toward public mistrust. The Watergate scandal probably belongs at the top. The Vietnam War generally probably belongs very close to the top, if not at the top of that, of a series of very devastating blows to the credibility of government. But I think the Pentagon Papers, and of course it's deeply intertwined with both Vietnam and Watergate, certainly belongs on that list of major episodes that really help account for the souring of American opinion when it comes to confidence in the reliability, the decency, the honesty of their leaders. And of course, I think we would all probably acknowledge to one degree or another that we still live in the era, at least with respect to this trend, that dates from the 1960s. So I apologize for going on a little bit long, and I would be happy to do questions and then, of course, talk about the document.